And so it is my privilege to introduce my colleague, Alicia Johnson, whose primary research interest is in Markov chain Monte Carlo methods. We worked together at Macalester College during my first teaching postdoc, and I learned how to teach statistics from Alicia. So a lot of my teaching origin story happened in Minnesota with Alicia. The focus of her research has been on the convergence rates of chains corresponding to MCMC algorithm and general state spaces. In addition, she enjoys the unlimited application of statistics, as well as taking eager teaching postdocs under her wing. As a consultant for the Division of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the University of Minnesota, she has collaborated on projects in entomology, forestry, primatology, public health, and others. In other words, her work in statistics allows her to keep learning a little about a lot. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson for our third talk this afternoon.
Thanks, Katie, for that very kind introduction. We miss you here. So let me share my screen. All right. Okay, so I guess in general, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm really honored to speak with this group today. As my title suggests, I'm going to be sharing some reflections on a recent book project, but the bigger picture is really about the steps I've been taking to align my courses more around inclusive, ethical, and active learning principles. So even if writing a book isn't on your to-do list, as it definitely wasn't on mine until recently, I never thought I was going to write a book. I hope that the general ideas still resonate. With that, I want to start with some context. Since people are joining from various places around the world, I'll start simply with where I am. Let's see here. All right, so I'm speaking from the US in the state of Minnesota, which is in the northern part of the country bordering Canada. I'm in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I'm blocks from this beautiful Mississippi River in my office on the campus of Macalester College. And if you keep zooming in and zooming in and zooming in on my office here, and you went back in time to the year 2013, this is what you would have seen on my desk. So at that time, I was developing my college's first course in Bayesian statistics. So this is only 8 years ago. So of course, Bayes was not some new thing, but there were zero to few models for teaching Bayes at the truly undergraduate level. So in developing this course, I took all of my Bayesian textbooks that I had on my shelf, and I sought to find a textbook for my course. Now, I had this whole stack of textbooks because I like all of these books. And so going into this, I thought the challenge was going to be to narrow this stack down to just one book. But as I sat down with these books, most of which had some synonym of introductory in the title, I realized I had some problems. Mainly, the appropriateness of the word introductory, of course, depends upon the audience. So though I realized that these textbooks would be excellent introductions to Bayes for somebody with my background, a PhD in statistics, I was pretty sure that my undergraduates were not going to find any of these to be easy, straightforward, or meat and potatoes. So long story short, I basically out of sheer necessity, not because it had been my goal to start off with, but out of sheer necessity, I started compiling my own Bayes resources. And though this started off as a solo project, I soon picked up two fantastic collaborators, Mina Dogucu and Miles Ott. In a point that's not at all superfluous to this talk, the shared empathy, humor, and kindness of these people not only made the collaboration more enjoyable, which was especially important and appreciated these past 18 months or so, that empathy, humor, and kindness really informed everything that came out of this collaboration, including everything that I'm going to be talking about today. So I just want to thank Miles and Mina at the top of my talk. Okay, so at our core, Miles, Mina, and I were all educators. Naturally, then when we sat down to collaborate on this Bayes project, we started by talking about what we want our individual Bayes courses to look like. To this end, our visions aligned around 4 shared principles. First, as you might hope, and very obviously, we all wanted our students to learn something about Bayesian statistics in our Bayesian statistics courses. But beyond this kind of obvious principle, the other three principles weren't at all unique to teaching Bayes, but are true to teaching any course that we have. So no matter the course topic, we aim to build classrooms that center inclusion and accessibility, meaning we want to ensure that all students in our courses feel seen, supported, and encouraged to have a voice in the classroom. Further, we align our courses around ethical principles for the data analysis pipeline. Finally, we empower our students to learn by doing. That is, none of us primarily stand at the front of our classroom and lecture at our students hoping for some magical knowledge transfer from our brain to theirs. Rather, we teach using active learning principles. So after setting these course goals, I'll project a bit. And as my title suggests, I think there's that dreaded time that comes when we have to identify some supplementary textbook manual or set of written resources, something that's going to support our students learning on the topic at hand. I say dreaded here because I don't know that, well, I can think of a couple instances, but it's been rare that I sit down with a textbook and I think, this is it, it matches everything, all of my goals for this course. As such, textbooks often feel somewhat distinct from objectives such as inclusion, ethics, and active learning, and are instead often viewed as a mere vehicle for content delivery. In other words, I can take care of these other principles, so inclusion, ethics, active learning, if only I can find a textbook that has some good Bayes content. But there are a few problems with this textbook as mere content delivery scenario. First, evolving best practices such as inclusion and accessibility. These are woven into the daily conversations at my college and higher education more broadly. Right, there are frequent emails, workshops, webinars, accountability groups, listening sessions, and so on these topics. But for the large part, at least in my experience, these conversations are happening at a higher college level and industry level. And they're not typically echoed in available materials for my courses. This kind of separation of those conversations from our course materials makes it feel like we're all out there on our own, trying to translate and weave these practices into our unique courses. Personally, I find this overwhelming at times. I'm constantly cycling through questions of how do I adapt these general principles into my unique course? Is my translation of these principles accurate? Am I doing enough? How do I balance it all? And so on. Second, when we view textbooks as mere content delivery, there's a serious disconnect for students, right? What's more important, the principles that they're learning in the classroom or those that are in the book? Those that are exhibited by their teacher or those by the textbook author. Finally, when we view textbooks as mere content delivery, we're sending a dangerous message that some of these best practices are important to the classroom, but not the broader machine learning community. So students in our classes might then assume that inclusion begins and ends in the classroom, ethics begin and end in the classroom. And beyond our own students, if these best practices aren't woven into textbooks and other written resources that we put out into the world, readers outside classroom settings might lose some exposure to these topics. So in light of these concerns of textbook as a vehicle for content delivery, Miles, Mina, and I set out to create a textbook that rethinks this standard assumption. Specifically, we set out to write a book that teaches Bayesian statistics in a way that centers inclusivity, emphasizes ethics, and empowers readers to learn by doing. So the result, Bayes rules, with an exclamation point, and possibly with this cover, if we can sneak it by the publishers, will be printed by CRC Press in early 2022 and is already available online. So that's kind of the general structure of our book. But the bigger takeaway of what I've been talking about in these first minutes is it applies beyond book writing. right? In general, if we value certain principles, then the resources that we create should reflect as much. So we can better align, what we value and what we're putting out into the world. All right, so that was the big picture of the Bayes rules project. Now that we have that big picture, I want to start digging into each of these different principles. I'm not going to talk about Bayes today, but I'll talk about inclusivity, active learning, and ethics. So we'll start with the principle of inclusion. Again, our goal here is to incorporate inclusive classroom practices, which ensure that all students and readers are invited, supported, and encouraged to have a voice in the conversation in the classroom. And by all, I mean regardless of gender identity, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, disability, and other identities and lived experiences. But before getting into how we addressed inclusion in our book, it's important to start with why. So why did we care about this in the first place? So whether we're talking about a classroom or a textbook, the negative impacts of a non-inclusive approach to teaching start with the individual. Right? It's naturally tough and sometimes even impossible to learn anything when you aren't seen, supported, and encouraged to participate. Thus, non-inclusive resources structurally leave behind some students while preferencing others. Most of the inclusivity trainings I've personally received focus on this exact point, thinking about students on this really individual level. But of course, it's also important to remember that leaving individuals out of the learning process has cascading impacts on society. Namely, our field loses out on broader perspectives and participation with detrimental effects. I'm going to start with a silly illustrative example about this idea. So for example, suppose that all hat manufacturers, so people that make hats, only took into account feedback from the people in my home state of Wisconsin. Now, if you're not familiar with Wisconsin, it's a state that's known lovingly, I hope, for its quirky love of cheese on plates and on heads. So if these hat manufacturers only talked to people in the state of Wisconsin, then everybody that was excluded from this feedback process, mainly everybody outside of Wisconsin, would be left with hats like this one that are shaped like cheese, thus suffer in both function and fashion. But of course, beyond silly examples, there's no lack of more serious examples of the detrimental impacts of non-inclusive practices on society. So the film Coded Bias is one example. It outlines the societal impacts of the non-inclusive development of facial recognition tools. So mainly when such artificial intelligence tools are designed by and around a non-representative group, they can perpetuate and amplify biases and discrimination. Western medicine provides another example. In the United States, it wasn't until 1993 that the Revitalization Act mandated that women and people of color be included in clinical trials. So 1993, it's not that long ago in the history of Western medicine. So it means that before 1993, it was just fine legally for medical practices and medications to be informed by white male patients alone. So we're still making up for lost time here. There being a weaker understanding of and emphasis on the health of women, people of color, and people with disabilities, to name just a few. So that's why we care about inclusivity. And next, I want to talk about how we've approached this goal in our book. But this discussion comes with a big disclaimer and confession, perhaps. So my co-authors and I are still learning about inclusive practices ourselves. I don't consider myself an expert on this topic. And I thought a lot about this before accepting the invitation to speak today, but I thought it's important to at least be part of the conversation and keep the conversation going. So on the lines of us not being experts and still learning here, we don't think that we've figured it all out, and we know that our book could be even more inclusive. And not only are we still learning on this topic, but just as we encourage readers to do in one of our exercises, we understand that everyone has a standpoint or perspective that influences how they perceive the world. So we don't assume or pretend that our standpoint is neutral or that we're above the fray here. And we continuously reflect on how this might impact the inclusivity of our book. And it's kind of hard to zoom out from yourself sometimes. So recognizing that we still have a lot of work to do on this topic, we also didn't feel that we were at liberty to say, let's just write an inclusive book and that it was magically gonna happen just by wishing it to be so. Rather, we knew that we had to be really intentional about this goal. To this end, we took inspiration from Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein's Data Feminism book. This book alone is excellent. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend doing so. But also excellent and inspiring is the process behind this book project. So at the onset of their project, and I've included a URL at the bottom here, the authors outlined a set of values and aspirational metrics for holding themselves accountable to these values. So for example, they identified specific structural problems that they wanted their book to counter. They set aspirational metrics for doing so, and they reported final metrics on how close their book came to meeting these aspirations. For example, to counter structural racism, the authors aspired to have at least 75% of their citations of feminist scholarship be from people of color. In the end, 32% of their citations met this criterion. Though 32% is lower than 75%, it's certainly higher than if the authors hadn't been so intentional about their goals. So following this lead of intentionality, Miles, Mina, and I compiled a list of inclusivity-related principles, and we consulted and held ourselves accountable to this list throughout the writing and editing process. So this list grew certainly throughout the span of our project, along with our understanding of inclusivity, and will no doubt be even longer if and when we put out a second version of the book. So our list doesn't have any numerical metrics, but it consists of several strategies that address two broad goals. First, understanding that people can't be included in conversations that they can't access. We aimed to increase the accessibility of a written textbook. Second, understanding that people can't fully participate in conversations that either don't welcome them in or in severe cases directly shut them out. We prioritize the use of inclusive language, assumptions, and examples. So I'm going to start with the first of these strategies, or the first goal of accessibility. So one aspect of book accessibility is, of course, financial. Somebody can't access material that they can't afford. Thus, in addition to a print version of this book, our book is already available for free online at bayesrulesbook.com. This online delivery also makes the book more accessible to readers around the world, no matter if they're within the reach of the publisher's distribution. So one little thing here is that the prohibitive cost of learning is a real thing and something that Miles, Mina, and I care deeply about. Yet I also acknowledge that open access options like this, so providing a version for free online, that's not necessarily personally or professionally viable for every author or project. I don't have a solution to this kind of quandary, but I'll be curious to hear if any of you have some ideas during the Q&A. All right, so beyond the financials, the physical properties of a book are also critical to its accessibility. To this end, my co-author, Mina Dogucu, did a ton of work to ensure that our book was accessible to readers with various vision impairments or deficiencies. First, in graphics that require the distinction between multiple colors, it's important to remember that there are several types of color blindness. For example, consider this plot that we created using the Bayes rules package, which accompanies our book. To understand how this image might appear to readers that have various color vision deficiencies, we utilized a colorblind simulator. So when we ran this image through the simulator, we learned that some readers wouldn't be able to distinguish the colors here as yellow, green, and blue, yet they will be able to distinguish them as different colors. So we shouldn't use descriptions yellow, green, blue in the book, but we can distinguish between the three groups being displayed here. As another example, so I use R. I'm going to be talking about a couple of R things throughout this talk, but again, the general ideas apply no matter what software you use. But throughout our book, we have a lot of graphics that are constructed using the ggplot2 package in R. And the plot shown here uses the default color palette. So if we do nothing to the colors, these are the colors that show up. So in this case, for this kind of default graph, we put it through the colorblind simulator and learned that readers with the very common red-green color blindness wouldn't be able to distinguish between two of the three groups in this plot. And if you can't distinguish between two of the three groups, it really makes it impossible to get any takeaways from that plot. Thus, throughout the book, we utilize color palettes that are accessible for most types of color blindness. I'm including the R code that we used to set our default color palette to the Okabe Ito palette. Again, whether or not you know R, the takeaway here is that it really only takes a few lines of code one time in a project to make it colorblind accessible. All right, next on this list of maximizing the physical accessibility of a book, it's also important to consider that some readers are blind or visually impaired. In this case, interacting with the book requires a screen reader. So a screen reader, if you're not familiar, it's essentially a software program that allows blind users to read text displayed on a computer screen via a speech synthesizer or a braille display. With this in mind, consider a snippet from our book. I know this is too small and too much to read here, but I just want to point out kind of the main components of what's contained in our book. So essentially, common to most statistics and machine learning texts, our book consists of text, code, and figures. But screen readers only provide direct access to two of these three components, the text and the code. So when a screen reader comes across a figure, it just notes, here's an image. It doesn't have the capability to process and describe the image for the reader on its own. Thus, if we want to make figures accessible, and we do because there are hundreds of figures in the book, and they're certainly critical to learning about Bayes, then we need to provide alt or alternative text. So consider the example here. As is typical, the discussion of the figure within the text focuses on kind of the takeaway message from the plot. So in this case, we see a plot of 3 p.m. versus 9 a.m. temperatures on a sample of days in Australia. And these temperatures exhibit a positive relationship. So the warmer it is in the morning, the warmer it tends to be in the afternoon. So that's general discussion, right? It doesn't provide readers with vision impairments a sense of what's actually in the plot itself or the characteristics of the plot. So to this end, authors can and should supplement figure discussions using alt text, which describes the actual properties of the image. So unlike figure discussions and captions, this alt text doesn't actually appear in the book, but it is picked up by screen readers. So we took two approaches to providing alt text in our book. In some cases, we wrote our own alt text, such as for the image here, which we utilized in a discussion of Bayesian statistics throughout history. To this end, just this year, and in a sign of progress on accessibility issues, the knit-r package behind the construction of our book added alt text functionality. So essentially in the same code chunk that includes our image file path, we can specify alt text using this fig.alt argument. So in this particular alt text, we first describe the composition of the image, saying that there are 4 framed photos that are aligned next to each other. And then we go more into the details. And again, we're trying to describe the image for readers with vision impairments. So we say that the portrait of Thomas Bayes is black and white with him wearing a regalia-like clothing. He has short dark hair. The photo of Ariana Rosenbluth is taken outside at the age of 86. She's wearing glasses, smiling, and has gray hair pulled back. So we're trying to help paint a picture here. Again, this alt text, just to reiterate, isn't a figure caption, so it's not going to appear in the book, but it's detected by screen readers to make this figure more accessible. So unlike this image here, the majority of figures in our book are like this one, graphs created using that ggplot2 package in R. So instead of writing our own text, alt text, for hundreds of these ggplots, we tested out the Braille R package authored by Jonathan Godfrey. So the Braille R package has a simple 2-step process to automating alt text. So first, we create a plot using the ggplot2 syntax. So here, if you're unfamiliar with ggplot2. And second, we then use the VI function within the Braille R package to automate alt text based on the R code that was used to create the graph. So this alt text provides some additional detail that wasn't in the discussion. So here indicating that the figure is an untitled chart with no subtitle or caption. It has an x-axis, temp 9 a.m. with labels 10, 20, and 30, and it includes a set of 200 points, and so on. All right, so the goal of this alt text is providing more detail about the actual properties of the image. This said, I think the Braille R package is an excellent resource, and it's one of the only, if not the only, R tool for automating alt text for screen readers. So it's the only that I personally know of. But as you're reading this, you might start thinking there are some drawbacks to using automated alt text, and you're right. So though alt text can pick up on the more technical features of the plot, so things like the axis labels and what the axes are, it's naturally going to miss some of the nuances and the bigger picture. So in this particular image, this alt text might be improved by pointing out not just that there are 200 points, but that they display a positive, moderate, linear relationship, for example. So with these drawbacks in mind, we're still in the process of reviewing the alt text in our book and expanding upon it as needed, because the kind of the success, I'll say, of alt text depends upon the plot. And beyond our own book, I'm hoping that the Braille R package is the first of many, or that the community continues to build up Braille R. Another thing that I find really promising in this area is that I heard from our publisher recently that they're soon going to be requiring authors to provide alt text, and this has not been true up until this point. All right, to recap, we took 3 approaches to increasing the accessibility of our book: providing an open access alternative, using colorblind accessible palettes, and providing alt text for images. The next piece that I want to talk about is the inclusivity part. So understanding that people can't fully participate in conversations that either don't welcome them in, or in severe cases directly shut them out. I want to discuss how we've utilized inclusive language, assumptions, and examples throughout our book. So the first strategy is pretty simple. So the first strategy that we use to make a broader group of readers feel welcome to jump into the Bayesian conversation was to highlight and showcase a broader group of scholars within the book. So from David Blackwell and Ariana Rosenbluth, whose work helped pioneer modern Bayesian statistics, to the rest of the people on this screen who are currently active scholars who are carrying this work forward. So to mention just a few here, Blitzstein and Wang's probability text provides an accessible treatment of this topic that's central to Bayesian statistics. As another example, Watts and Knudsen's work in computational statistics supports the tools that are actually needed to implement the Bayesian philosophy. And a bunch of other amazing people on this slide, of course. With this point here, I just want to recognize Catherine Kinnaird, one of the conference organizers here. She was the first person in my own personal orbit. I remember talking about this in my office. She really stressed the importance of and carried through on exposing students to a diverse group of scholars. So thanks, Catherine. All right. Next on our list in developing inclusive classrooms and resources is to avoid, I don't know if there's a technical term here, but I'm just going to say that we try to avoid what I'll call club language, assumptions, and examples. So what I mean here is trying to avoid creating an overall vibe in a classroom or a book, being that of a people who are like me, but not like you club. So for simplicity, I'll lump such clubs into two broad categories. The first being clubs that assume some shared set of specialized knowledge. For example, knowledge about sports minutia or physics minutia. And when I say specialized knowledge, I'm not saying there can't be examples about sports or physics, but just that it should be at a level that everybody can understand. So not the minutia. Second are the types of clubs that assume some narrow shared identity and set of experiences. For example, clubs that assume a shared heteronormative identity or white upper middle class perspectives. So to clarify the issues here and what I mean by club language, assumptions and examples, let's consider just two examples. All right, first, consider clubs that assume some shared specialized knowledge here about sports. So take, for example, this discussion. So let pi be the proportions of time, or proportion of times that on a fourth down in inches, an American football team attempts a conversion instead of a punt. So I understand what this means because I grew up watching football, American football. But unless a person is familiar with the minutia of American football, this is going to sound like some secret language, right? And it's almost certainly the case that somebody does not understand this. So it might as well be that we write an example that says, let pi be the proportion of times that on a what's it and who's it an American football team attempts a huh instead of a wha. It just makes no sense. So this is problematic. Using examples, specialized examples like this is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, trying to teach a technical machine learning concept through a specialized context like this is like if you imagine trying to teach a child to read using passages about retirement plans, right? It's really just impossible to learn a concept when it's delivered within a context that you don't understand. Second, when you have really specialized examples like this, you might be sending a message that there's, again, some kind of specialized club that not all readers are a part of. And this can be both demoralizing and a distraction from the material that we're actually trying to teach. So we're trying to teach Bayesian statistics, not American football. So luckily the fix here is really straightforward. To avoid the specialized knowledge club, we tried to either utilize applications that are fairly universal or at least take the time to explain the context when we are using more specialized settings. So notice that I've put fairly universal in parentheses to acknowledge that our sense or my sense of what's universal is again biased by my unique identity and experiences. So that said, examples in our book that I do think fall under this universal category are topics like weather, bicycle ridership, and song popularity. Not of all of them, but I found this type of club particularly challenging to avoid because I think we all have our specialized interests, and we really want to talk about those. So this can be challenging. All right. So on another type of club, so consider the incorrect assumption that all students or readers share a heteronormative identity. To this end, here are some examples or principles that we held ourselves accountable to when developing examples and discussions that involve people. So first, recognizing that gender isn't binary, we utilized multiple gender pronouns. For similar reasons, we avoided men versus women examples or examples that rely on binary male versus female comparisons. And those examples also tend to make heteronormative assumptions. Second, when citing scholars, we did our best to ensure that we were using the correct gender pronouns and that we didn't dead name a scholar or mistakenly use a transgender scholar's birth name. So making sure that we were using the right name and pronouns was a little bit challenging when discussing authors that are no longer living. But we did do our due diligence or tried to do our due diligence when using names and pronouns for living scholars. So to this end, we relied on personal websites, ORCID IDs, social media accounts, and so on. Finally, on this topic, we incorporated examples which reflect the fact that not everybody shares a heterosexual identity. All right, another strategy that we used to make readers feel supported and welcome was to combat the proof is obvious attitude. I assume that everybody here can think of examples when a professor blew past some material or a proof, thinking that it should be obvious to you, or you read a textbook that said, obviously this result is true, bypassing any follow-up or clarification. I've definitely had that experience quite a few times. So these types of assumptions of what's obvious to people or what should be obvious can be both wrong and demoralizing. Thus, just as in our classrooms, we avoid saying this is obvious or clearly. So we tried to also counter that in our book. So we worked specifically to actively embrace mistakes, questions, and different academic backgrounds. Just as a few examples of this, we note up front in the book that as you read the book and put Bayesian methodology into practice, you will make mistakes, many mistakes, and making and learning from mistakes is simply part of learning. So our goal here is just to normalize that kind of struggle of learning or the iterative process of learning, right? It takes iteration and practice, and you are going to make mistakes. So setting it as an assumption from the start. As another example, we note in the second chapter of the book that no matter their level of previous experience, readers should expect to take this chapter slow. So the hope here is to counter any imposter syndrome by normalizing the fact that humans can't magically ingest and process information, right? Again, learning takes time and iteration. So unfortunately, this particular lesson wasn't something that I really had until graduate school. And I had this revelatory conversation with my dissertation advisor. So I just remember going into his office, our first research meeting, and he gave me this seminal paper in our field. And then I think he most likely saw how big my eyes got when I looked at that paper, because it just looked really overwhelming. And I think even the first sentence, I was pretty lost. And I just remember him kindly noting that I should expect to sit down with this paper for a while, that it's not a one read, and I'm magically going to know everything at the end of one read. So knowing that he didn't expect me to walk in the next day with all the answers was important for so many reasons, not just stress, but for actually the learning process and setting the expectation of iteration. All right, finally, we aim to use language that creates a welcoming environment for readers with different technical or academic backgrounds. For example, we don't assume that all readers know the Greek alphabet, thus give readers a heads up on the letters and how to pronounce them. So in this chapter, we're going to be using the Greek letters lambda and mu, for example. Again, just sending a signal that this isn't a private language. We're trying to invite you into this conversation. Now, none of these ideas, I would say, are particularly mind-blowing. These are the types of things that I say in class and signal in class on a daily basis. Again, the idea here is that if embracing things like mistakes, questions, and different backgrounds is something that we find important in the classroom, then a textbook should echo that. Our final strategy for creating an inclusive learning environment was to build rapport. Now, since you're not in the same room together, building rapport between authors and readers is a little bit different, and I would say a little bit tougher than building rapport between a teacher and students that are together daily in the same classroom. But it's still important and possible. So our simple approach here was the same as our approach in the classroom, mainly just to be ourselves. We don't walk into our classroom as formal robots. To put it simply, so to build rapport, we, again, try to be ourselves. So just a few examples of this in our book, in addition to an exclamation point in the title, which I've heard from friends, colleagues, and others seems bizarre. We have a book logo that is a somewhat silly disco ball with a very loose analogy to the Bayesian philosophy. Beyond this, we use things like casual imagery and analogies to build intuition for technical concepts, such as the rainbows here that invoke the big idea behind grid approximation techniques. Similarly, our conversations tend to be conversational, such as that here, which introduces readers to the concept of overfitting through a story about a taco stand operator that builds their entire taco stand menu exclusively around the tastes and preferences of a friend who exclusively loves anchovies. So our hope here is that by using informal language and sharing some of our personalities, whether or not the readers have to like those personalities, but our hope is that readers at least feel welcomed into the learning process and more seen themselves. Another motivation for this more informal approach is to avoid some hidden curriculum. So here's what I mean by that. Though reading formal academic prose, like you might see in textbooks, some textbooks, that might feel like second nature to some people in this room because we've had a lot of practice. It's like learning a foreign language in general, right? It took us a long time for this kind of formal academic prose to feel natural. Now, the deeper and deeper you get into a discipline, the more formal academic prose might make sense. But it definitely should not be a barrier to entry in the field, right? It shouldn't be a barrier keeping somebody from an introduction to a topic. So in particular, treating formal academic prose as this hidden curriculum or this unofficial norm or accepted status quo, it disproportionately impacts readers and students that haven't had access to this type of training. And that applies to most readers. All right, to recap, Miles, Mina, and I held ourselves accountable to 7 general strategies to increase the accessibility and inclusivity of our book. In the second batch of strategies around inclusivity, we made more visible a diverse group of scholars. We avoided club language assumptions examples. We embraced mistakes, questions, and different backgrounds. And we built or tried to build rapport by being ourselves. Again, we're viewing this framework, to just emphasize one last time, we're viewing this framework as a preliminary but necessary start. We expect this list to evolve with our understanding of accessibility and inclusion. And we also hope that it evolves in collaboration with other people here or other educators in the field. So just a preliminary start here. Beyond the specific strategies, the bigger takeaway of all of this conversation about increasing the inclusivity and accessibility of our book is that whether we're talking about a book or a classroom, inclusivity and accessibility require intentionality and accountability. So each chapter that we wrote and edited it went through at least 3 cycles of evaluation. So through Miles, Mina, and I, we all took passes at writing and editing with these strategies in mind. And had we not done this so intentionally, we would have likely fallen into the same pitfalls that we are trying to avoid. The last thing I'll say on this topic is just a little bit about the feedback. So the general feedback surrounding these efforts has been, in general, very positive. And our editor at CRC has been very supportive of our efforts and our vision throughout the whole writing and editing process. But I just want to address some more contemplative conversations that we've had with friends, colleagues, and reviewers along the way. Contemplative and supportive conversations, I'll note. So one topic that has come up is whether the more conversational tone or other aspects of the book might not appeal to more serious readers. So to that, when Miles, Mina, and I kind of reflected on this type of feedback, our reaction was that all of these aspects of the book are intentional, right? We view them as features of the book, not bugs. Further, though we don't take ourselves too seriously, we're very serious about teaching Bayesian statistics and teaching in general. And both of those things can be true, right? We don't have to take ourselves too seriously in order to be serious about teaching Bayes. And finally, our bigger concern is about the huge number of readers that are turned away from more serious books. So books that are, again, overly formal, academic prose, that's not necessarily accessible to all readers at that level. So we're more concerned about kind of that dynamic than readers who might pick up our book and think, I'm too serious for this book. Another topic that has come up when describing some of the principles behind the book is whether it would be too political. And on this end, I also disagree. When we're talking about inclusivity and accessibility, it's, to me, not political at all, right? So it's just like wearing a face mask during a global pandemic. These ideas, inclusion and accessibility, should not be politicized. So in general, positive feedback, but those are just a couple of the conversations that we engaged in on the way. Okay, so with that, I was going to move on to the next topics, but as is standard, I talked longer than I thought I would. And so instead of maybe diving into 2 new topics and not giving them their due course, I will just skip to the end and conclude, since all right. Sorry about that. All right. I always fear that I'm going to run out of things to say. And I don't think it's ever happened, but it's still my fear. All right. So in conclusion, Miles, Mina, and I have tried to rethink what a textbook can and should be. For us, this meant looking past the book as mere Bayes content delivery and better aligning it with other learning objectives for our courses. So I've talked about how we've aligned it with inclusivity and accessibility practices, but there are other strategies that we've used to align it around ethical practices and active learning approaches. So beyond our own project here, there are bigger general ideas that I hope people take away from the talk. First, if we value certain principles, so if we value certain principles in our classroom, for example, in our teaching, then everything that we create in that classroom and beyond should reflect as much. A second takeaway is that creating inclusive and accessible materials in classrooms, it requires intentionality and accountability. It just doesn't happen by wishing it to be so. And to this end, I would definitely recommend coming up with your own list of accessibility and inclusive goals. Oh, the final thing that I wanted to say about that is, yeah, again, this is just an ongoing topic. So we're still learning here. And I think that our preliminary approach will continue to evolve again with our own learning and hopefully in collaboration with others in the field. The final thing I'll say, I'll skip that third bullet point, is that I hope that you consider writing a book. So when I started, like I said, I never thought I was going to be writing a textbook. It didn't seem like it was going to be the most exciting project. And I started this project out of necessity. And I have to say that of the work that I've produced throughout my career, it's definitely been the most valuable experience to me, and has been pretty mind-blowing actually throughout the process, and just has taught me to think a lot more intentionally, not just about writing, but about my teaching, and also just aligning the things that I do in my life around principles that I value. So I hope that others continue writing a book. The standard textbook model has been around for a really long time, and we have a chance to together recreate and reevaluate what a textbook can be. So with that, just a final thanks to Miles and Mina, who have been amazing collaborators, and also my colleagues at Macalester College. A lot of my thinking around inclusion and accessibility is based on conversations that I've had with them. So they've sat with me and done this work around, how can we translate what we're learning kind of at the college or industry level about these principles? How can we better weave them into our curriculum and courses? All right. So with that, thanks to you all for being here.
Cool. Thank you, Alicia. Quite a wonderful presentation. I really loved it. As we are running a bit late in the workshop, I would love to first ask the audience if there are pressing questions. Apparently, that is not the case. I collected two questions that in the Hack and D-Pad. And I invite the audience, if you still feel that there is something you would like to ask Alicia, feel free to put them down. So my first question is maybe a little bit hypothetical. So apologies for this. But I was wondering, these alt-text explanations, sometimes when you convey a concept to someone, it helps if the same concept is explained or described just differently, right? So I'm wondering if these alt-text explanations might also help non-impaired readers, basically, if they would be accessible to them. That's why I think this question is a little bit academic, but so how do you feel about this?
No, I think that's a great point. And I mean, anybody can download and use a screen reader, but I mean, that doesn't mean that people will. And that those alt texts, I like that point of having them available to readers. I don't know if it would be as a footnote, for example, but I've realized about my own teaching, even when it gets to the advanced levels. So I'm teaching a senior seminar this semester on Bayesian statistics. And I notice in myself that I do take for granted students' practice and experience with interpreting graphs. So I do like that idea of having that alt text either in, say, a margin or the footnotes of a book.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, in the physical book frame, it's hard to implement.
Yeah, but it's totally possible in an online version. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, and the second question that came to my mind was when you wrote the book, also with the team, did you keep reader personas at your side? So little stories that describe how your readers, or with what facilities your readers would ingest the book. So for whom you're writing this?
Yeah, we thought a lot about that. At the time, so Miles Ott now is not currently teaching, but at the time that we started this Miles and Mina and I were all at liberal arts colleges, so undergraduates only. And then Mina is now at a research one university, so University of California at Irvine. So kind of a lot of our experience and what shaped the book is our experience of undergraduate teaching. So that was kind of that's the audience that we understand best in terms of previous training and experience, and just have a better understanding of who those students are.
Okay.
But we also really hope that this is an accessible intro for people outside of school who have comparable undergraduate training, for example. So people who are in the fields of, out working as a machine learner that want to pick up Bayes. So it's just a more accessible intro.
Cool. Thank you. Awesome. Well, because I'm asking this question because in the carpentries we typically value learner personas very much, and I was just wondering if you use that. Okay. Cool. That said, I really appreciate you took your time also to prepare these slides and to present them to us. I really enjoyed your presentation. And with that, I would love to conclude.